I'm going to be doing this session about whip speeches, the role that whip speeches play in the debate, and how you can craft that debate-winning whip speech so that you too can be an awesome debater just like me. Does anybody, before we start, have any questions specifically about whip speeches, what they are, and what your experience have been so far?
I do have a question,
Mhm.
and I'm going to phrase it carefully. It's that, is there a strategic purpose at WHIP to be directly discussing how you come across versus your opening half? Not if it's a good debate practice or not, but is it strategic?
I don't think it is strategic. The reason I don't think it is strategic is that it is just eating up time that could always be better spent. There might theoretically be some good, like some debate somewhere where it is useful to rebut your own opening half, but I have simply never encountered one. It is always just a better use of your time to be talking about your own extension, because in a sort of narratological debate theory sense, everything that you are saying about your opening half, even to rebut it, is still words that are making your adjudicator think that that half is the half that is important to talk and think about, rather than your material. So it's almost always a bad idea. I'll talk about that more as we go on. But before we do that, I can share screen with the whiteboard to put up the two things that I want to say in this, or at least I could if it was working properly. Where's the toolbar? Fine, you can all deal with just seeing the faces. All right. As everyone knows, I've been on a classics binge recently, which means I've been reading a lot of obscure poetry. Specifically, I was reading the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and there is a great verse in there that is about the nature of fate. And that verse is, "The moving finger writes and having writ moves on, nor all thy piety nor wit can lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it." Your speech is not like this. Cross things out. Edit your speech. Go back into it. Cross things out that are no longer relevant. This is the most important thing that I can tell you about any like closing half speech, but it goes doubly for whip because you will accumulate a huge number of things that you could say by the end of the debate. You have an enormous amount of time. You have to edit things down. You have to be brutal with what you're going to include. And as we go on, I'm going to be talking about how you choose what to include and what to exclude. The other thing that I would say, and this would be my second slide if I was going to bother doing slides, is that you need to have a vision of the debate and enforce that vision on the debate. Again, I'll be talking about that more as we go on. But those are the two things that you need to remember out of this session. Be willing to cross stuff out and have a vision of the debate that you then enforce on that debate. So let's talk specifically about whip speeches and what to do if you're a whip speaker. The first thing that I want to note here is that you have a lot of time if you are the whip speaker. There is a long time between the start of the debate and the point at which you get up to speak, right? Especially if you're opposition whip, but even if you're government whip. What that means is that you don't have to start writing out your speech right away. You have time to settle back, think about what's important, track the important arguments, write things out, not as you're going to say them, but just as general ideas. You're still, in a way, continuing a lot of your brainstorming session that you were going through in prep time. So use that time. Use that time firstly to start tracking the important ideas out of the opening half. What sort of things are in the opening half that are so important that they demand a response? What does opening think is important and would demand a response? You don't necessarily have to agree with your opening about that, but it's worth working out what they think the center of their case is, because they're going to be trying to persuade the adjudicator that that's the center of the debate, and you're going to be need to respond to that. You also want to, once you've worked out a couple of what the important ideas of the debate are, use a separate piece of paper that can have space for many responses, but don't necessarily commit that piece of paper to a particular theme. So for example, if there's an idea that opening half has, and you can think of 5 different pieces of rebuttal to it, or 4 different pieces of rebuttal to it, put it at the top of a piece of paper, write out your dot point responses, and put it to one side so that you've got it there, so that when you do come up with what that theme fits under when it comes to your extension, you're able to take that piece of paper and just insert it into the speech. These like note-taking things make an enormous difference when you're trying to adapt to new circumstances in the debate as the debate goes on, because you might not have necessarily settled on what you think the extension was. There's probably going to be another speech out of opening half that might change what that extension could be. You also want to be thinking about what are these small gaps in our opening speech. So if your opening speeches are doing a good job on a particular theme, but they've missed one or two pieces of analysis, it's very useful to have those again on just a piece of paper that you can insert into the speech somewhere. Our opening dealt with this mostly, but I want to add two things here. And then you add those things. If you can, you make an argument about why those things were important, but sometimes it's useful just to claim as a closing half team that you have been able to come up with your own original responses to particular ideas. The last thing about this and what to be doing during this part of the debate is that if you have an idea for what the extension might be, communicate it to your member, but only if it takes just a few seconds to communicate. Your member is probably very deep in thought throughout all of this process because they have to actually write the extension and they're speaking before you. Make sure that they have time to communicate and then say what your idea is. So for example, in the world's octafinal topic, which was that something about Japanese soldiers in World War II who did not participate in war crimes should still be held morally accountable for those war crimes. We were struggling to come up with an extension. We're closing opposition. But at some point in the opening half, my partner Tom has an idea. And he turns to me and he says, it's not just that they weren't wrong to not participate. It's that they made the correct moral choice. And that became the extension now. They were right to choose to be passive resistors to the ongoing atrocities, right? And that became the extension because we communicated. And that communication is one of the most important things in this. And that brings me on to the talk. The talk is when you communicate with your member about what the extension specifically is. What is the extension? Literally turn to them and ask them this. I recommend doing this at the start of the speech before your member's speech. So if you're on government side, this is at Deputy Leader of Opposition, like at the start of Deputy Leader of Opposition. And if you're on opposite side, it's at the start of the government member's speech. Turn to them and say, what is the extension? And ideally, they will have one short sentence or even one word as the response. The extension is corruption. The extension is ghettos. The extension is Russian politics. The extension is backlash, right? Then you're on the same page and you can start crafting your speech. You want to work out what type of extension it is from that. Is it a new stakeholder, a new mechanism, or a new harm? Sometimes it's a combination. Backlash in teachers' unions. You're talking about one specific mechanism in one specific stakeholder. All right, fine. This is the tools that I have now to win this debate. Okay. Sometimes instead of being one specific thing or one piece of matter, it's a new interpretation of the debate. So a new first principles clash. You're changing from a consent first principles clash to an economics first principles clash, or you're changing position from a soft line to a hard line, or vice versa. Unideally, you don't have much to extend on. You have a couple of disparate pieces of analysis and you don't know how they fit together. Sometimes you'll be able to tie them together for your member, sometimes you can't. But if they are just 3 new ideas on things that exist already, then you still need to know them. They still need to be communicated to you and you still need to be making decisions on how you edit your speech based on these are my tools at closing to win this debate. The next thing to say about that talk is if you are the member and you settle on your extension early, just tell your whip. Just tell your whip, okay, I don't think they took any of the stuff on corruption, we're going with corruption. Or it looks like they've missed this stakeholder completely, I'm just gonna write this out, if anything changes, I'll let you know. But make sure that you are communicating, make sure you're on the same page. And if you are on a pro-am team in BP, it is always the responsibility of the pro to have this talk. It really, really is. And if the extension isn't communicated between the partners, that's always, always on the pro. Why do we have this talk? What purpose does it serve? Firstly, it forces your member to clarify the extension in their own mind, and that can't be overestimated. Sometimes this is just a guiding hand of the whip to make sure that everything is on track, because sometimes you just get lost in your thoughts as member speaker, or lost in the nitty-gritty details of something, and you haven't stepped back and thought about how you're going to package this stuff. Sometimes you need a prompt to do that. Secondly, it gives you time to put the pieces of matter into their context. And thirdly, it gets you to the ideal position you want to be in as whip speaker, which is being able to say, this debate is about X. This debate is about corruption. This debate is about whether or not backlash is going to outweigh the potential gains of this new campaign. This debate is about this. You want to tell that to your adjudicator, sometimes even in that explicit wording. Before I go on, does anybody have any questions about that talk or how it should operate?
Any tips on how to do it in an online context?
Have a Discord room. I've found that Discord calls often don't have, often steal audio away from the Zoom meeting, but Discord rooms seem to function perfectly well. If you don't have Discord, it's a free thing. You can download it. It's relatively easy. You can also get mobile versions. You can make a server for free, so that's fine. I would recommend to the executive having a Monash Association of Debaters Discord server that just has debate 1 OG, debate 1 OO, debate 1 blah, 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 and then debate 2 OG. Just has rooms so that people can go to. I think that would actually be quite useful. But as far as I know, Discord is the best thing. It does mean that you need to manage your mute function on multiple platforms, but that's sort of a necessary precondition. I would also say that it's worth just like asking your member or the person you're communicating with, do you have a moment to chat? Because sometimes they're going to be halfway through writing a point and they want to be able to finish writing that before they sort of get distracted with what you're going to be telling them. Any other questions?
If you're the pro whip, and your member's just not very clear on what the extension is because opening half's been very high quality, do you have any advice about how to sort of make that talk better or clearer?
Sometimes that's going to be just conveying confidence. Sometimes it's going to be about giving a specific nuance of analysis to them. It's difficult to say exactly what you're going to need to do because the higher the class of the room, the more likely it is that you're going to need to be very, very adaptive and responsive to that room. But in general, it's things like saying, I think that most of the corruption stuff is still on the table, specifically how it interacts with this group. And I think that we should argue this thing, and this thing. And if it's at that point, it is the most important thing to communicate to your novice what the extension is, right? Yeah, it'll mean that they miss some rebuttal that they could be writing in that time, but this is just more important. So you need to be on that same page, right? Any final questions before I move on?
I have one. If you literally have no idea what to do as an extension and you get up, and by the time you get there, everything's been taken and literally anything you come is a derivative, what do you do at that point?
I would try and give a speech you're proud of. If like, you are being judged on whether or not you deliver a good extension. You are probably not winning the debate if you literally have nothing to say, right? But maybe you can just give a speech that is on your side. Yeah, it's derivative, but you give a speech that you're proud of. You get more comfortable with arguments. That's a learning experience for you. And maybe your adjudicator wasn't paying attention and they get hoodwinked. Or maybe you just turn it into a gov bench win or whatever. And sometimes this is something that you can do as whip speaker because you're taking that step back and thinking about the debate more structurally, whereas your member might be like having to write a little bit more desperately. So do take that time. And the other thing I'd say just on those speakers that seem to have a lot of polish, I mean, when me and Michael did that tournament 2 weekends ago, I don't think there was a single time when our extension material was stolen by opening. And our opening was like Uday. And we'd still have everything on the table because a lot of these speakers aren't taking the good material. They're just taking lots of material. But sometimes it does happen. Sometimes you really don't have anything. And then, yeah, you just Treat it as a learning experience. All right. So, moving on. What does it mean to have a vision of the debate and to enforce that vision on the debate? What I mean by this is that when you're deciding that your extension is a particular thing, you are deciding that you are going to make arguments, not just that that extension is true, but that that extension is the nature of the debate that we are having, is the important material. That is your vision of what is important to the debate. Your vision of what is important to the debate is that you are advocating for a particular stakeholder and that this debate is about how we best serve the needs of that stakeholder. Or you think that the debate is about, can this stakeholder be compared to another stakeholder? Or you think this debate is about whether or not governments have a legitimate role to intervene in the personal affairs of its citizens. These are big questions. These are your big first principle clashes, right? And you're saying the debate is about these things, or it's about that mechanism, or about that stakeholder. Enforcing it on the debate is another thing. The first thing I would say about this is that you need to be using the structural markers of your speech in sophisticated, like, strategic ways. Use your introductions, use your conclusions, use the way that you title your points, the ordering of your points, the way you answer POIs. These are the structural markers of your speech in order to convey that you think that this is the important idea. It's difficult to describe in a short session why that's important or how that's important. I can link you to the scholarly material I made when I was still in university about narratology and debating if you really, really want. But essentially, when you are trying to convey a vision of the debate, those structural markers are picked up on even subconsciously, and people do respond to those. The thing I would say about enforcing your vision of the debate, and this gets on to James's question earlier, is that this is not rebutting your own side. Firstly, there are rules in BP about whether or not you're allowed to rebut your own side that apparently we've all decided to ignore for some reason. That being said, I have, as I said, never seen this be an efficient use of time. I've never seen a debate where it was better to be talking about why your own side was wrong in the opening half, rather than just giving material that is better. Just give the material. Just say, I want to extend on our openings material here and give the good material. And as an adjudicator, when closing half teams try to rebut their own side, usually what I'm thinking is they're doing this because they don't have enough good material themselves and they just need to tear everyone else down. Don't do it. I don't think it's a good strategy. Because even rebutting your openings material is words said about how important it is. I don't think it's a good strategy. But then again, I'm an old dinosaur classicist. Maybe I'm wrong. The next thing to say is within each of your themes that you have, so if you're doing this in rebuttal, like you're a third speaker in 3-on-3, you will have your generic themes about the debate. Within each of those themes, don't just have a collection of ideas vaguely associated with a key word. Instead, have an argument you are trying to make about that thematic idea, a vision of how you think the world works. Make it as if, like, structurally, as if you're giving a first speaker speech and you're making a substantive argument about it. It's just that it happens after a bunch of responses, and so you can, like, know where to repair the material. What that means is that you should also be writing a topic sentence for your theme. If your theme is about corruption, don't just say, my first theme is corruption. Say, my first theme is going to be about how Western companies corrupt developing nations in their pursuit of profits, right? Because that will convey something, and it conveys not just to your adjudicator, but to you, that you have a purpose with each piece of material that you present under this theme. Then take your paper with multiple points that you have from opening half and edit those down to the points that contribute to the big idea that you're making. So your responses on corruption aren't just things that make the other side's argument about corruption not true. Sometimes you want to do that, but you want to be spending your time on which of those, on working out which of those responses most contributes to your vision of who corporations are, how developing nations' governments operate, so that those then contribute to the bigger theme that you have in the debate, the extension that you have in the debate. And that's how you get your extension from just being a piece of argument that exists in the debate to being the argument that resolves the lingering questions of the debate. And that's how you enforce that as a theme on the debate. Because you want each response that you make as you go through your responses on a particular theme to contribute to the logic of the bigger argument that you are making as a speaker. And later on, we're going to be watching Steve Hines' World's 2010 Whip speech, and you will see exactly how this happens. To give some examples of how you might do this in various different types of extensions, if you have a new mechanism as your extension, maybe one of your themes is going to be some version of describing how your mechanism functions. So when you're responding to an idea of, is your mechanism likely or more likely than other mechanism that somebody else had in the debate, that can go under there because you're saying, yes, it is more likely because here is how that mechanism operates on its various stakeholders. And so you're not just responding, you are also building the substantive momentum of here is how our mechanism operates and why it's so plausible and why it's so likely. If the question is, does your mechanism lead to bad outcomes? You're describing here is what things will look like at the end of our mechanisms. When somebody else has a stakeholder they put into the debate, you can say, yeah, but here is how our mechanism affects that stakeholder at the end of its process. We think that these things are harmful, so that you're again responding, but you're also contributing to how you build up the substantive arguments about that mechanism and demonstrating for your adjudicator that that mechanism resolves the substantive clashes of the debate, right? If it's not a mechanism, but instead it's like a new clash in the debate, then find ways to minimize old clashes of the debate. Is that old clash perhaps not as controversial as the opening half teams wanted to think, because either there are good ways to get around that clash, or because you don't think it's necessary to contest it, or because you don't think it was the most important, or it's easily resolvable, or it's just a sub point of a larger clash, like consent might be the opening government, but you think that is a sub point of the greater way that we understand the role of government in limiting people's actions. And it's not just about consent, it's also about how that consent interacts with social utility. We're going to explain why that's a subpoint. We're going to explain how that social utility is actually the most important thing. And then you've subtly shifted the debate away from consent and onto your actual material and your extension in the debate. If you, for example, have a new stance that you want to contribute into the debate, why does taking that stance nullify ops material? This is how you go through their material and say, yes, but what we demonstrated with our new soft aligned stance, which is the way this thing actually operates in the real world, is that that material no longer operates, or there was a compromise that was able to be found when this was implemented in country X, right? And so you start nullifying that material. It means that like reasonable accommodations were made, and the nightmare hellscape of that op describes just simply never actuated. It's actually really easy to implement this. And so we don't have to have this gigantic clash. And instead, the clash is this other thing that we were talking about, or the clash is how reasonable governments might interpret the words of this topic, something like that. If you're like, if the opening half was soft line and you're now going hard line as the closing half team, well, it's because it means that you get bigger benefits for not much bigger cost. And your speech's whip is basically, here is how we get much bigger benefits because we were hardline. And here is why all of the harms happen in the soft line world anyway, maybe slightly bigger in our world, but that is way outweighed by our new bigger benefits that we're able to claim because we're doing this mechanism in its most hardcore, most extreme version, right? And so you're making that comparative. But all of this stuff then becomes responses that you can put into other teams, but you just order them in such a way that you're making the bigger logic of the debate cohere in the adjudicator's mind. And if your stance is just empirically correct, well, your reasons why it is correct are going to be your responses to everything. So, you know, that'll be fine. If, however, you are extending on a bunch of different random things because all the good extension material was taken, then just memorize the phrase, why was our analysis that X so important here? Here's why. And just keep saying that, because that's what you're going to say. You're going to say, here's the context of the debate of what the debate was. Here is the new material that we added. But why was our analysis so important here? Because it delivers these extra things. And those things interact with the material in the debate in this way. Only be talking about your extension if you can at all help it. The last thing I want to say before we get on to watching videos, because that's always the fun part of these sessions, is dealing with stuff that doesn't fit neatly into your extension or neatly into the things that you have. This is often closing half extension comes out and it's really new and important, and you can't deal with it, especially if you're government whip. You probably want to leave space in your extension to be able to respond to something new that comes out at closing half, because you're the only speaker that can respond to it. Or perhaps it's an opening theme that's too important to let go because it really was the important material of the debate and you're trying to move it away, but you know in your heart you can't, and it's still not your extension. Okay, if you have to, have it as a separate point, but enforce rigorous discipline on it. If it looks like the point is going to be large, if you can't edit it down, if it's just impossible to do this point in under 5 minutes, either push it to the back of your speech because you are in danger of not getting past it and getting to your own material, cross out anything but the absolute most relevant point, or get rid of it entirely. It is more important to be talking about your extension. It just is, right? And maybe that means that you don't take it over one of the teams, but you're unlikely to take it by going the other way and only spending time talking about the opening half and not how your extension deals with it, right? If you can integrate it into something about your extension, or if you can run it as, but in comparison to the harms we brought you at extension, do that, right? And that is something that you can do relatively quickly. Just do that and move on. But even if you are doing that, even if you think you can edit it down, always do at least something about your extension first, even if it's just highlights. One thing that I find very useful is having a piece of paper that has just the dot points of our extension. And I sometimes do this even just while my member is speaking, and just be like, okay, harm to this stakeholder, this new mechanism, this new idea under this clash. And then at WIP, you get up and you just say, what we told you at extension was 3 things. You say those things, you say there was no response on these things. If that's true, if it's not true, then say, I'll get to the responses later. But now let's deal with the opening half clash, or now let's deal with this, because you cannot afford to get to 6 minutes and your adjudicator is still thinking, why haven't they mentioned the extension? You just can't. It is debate losing to be in that position. So don't do it. So that's my prepared remarks. Does anybody have any questions before we look at a video? I take this as a resounding no. So